Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Good evening, X. While browsing the archives, I came across a thread about unusual experiences while working in a hospice. I was reminded of several incidents that occurred while I was working as a nursing assistant at an old folks' home in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm skeptical by nature, and only gravitate to this board in the spirit of being creeped out, spooked. I don't intend to generate creepypasta or construct some elaborate scheme to horrify you all. But the anonymous nature of this board means that I can be honest and open about these experiences, because I've always wanted to discuss them. At the very least, I hope that you might be entertained. Canterbury Place was originally an Episcopalian orphanage. There was a fire that burned down part of the building. I know the story would be more interesting if children died, but there were no casualties. The building was renovated, and became a convalescent home for nuns. Eventually a large company purchased the property, and expanded the building both outward and upward. The original building, however, is intact. This picture shows the old entrance. Somebody more adept at image manipulation could zoom in and read the sign. I worked the evening shift, and often pulled doubles and stayed overnight. There was a lot of speculation about the place being haunted, but I was dismissive. The residents would frequently call and complain that there were children running up and down the halls, and could we hush them? A lady called in the middle of the night and said that a little girl entered her room and sat in her chair. She tried to offer her cookies, but she didn't respond. The little girl left before I made it to the room. A usually lucid and polite older gentleman would set out snacks and a drink for Aggie, a woman who sat in his recliner and sometimes refused to leave when he was ready for bed. I occasionally had to kick this imaginary Aggie out of the room so he could sleep. That being said, I dismissed this as old people being old and demented. One night, I was doing rounds. It was either 1 or 3 a.m. Can't remember which, but we go every 2 hours. We peek in the residents' rooms, and make sure they're not dead or on the floor. I arrived at the room of a sweet 90-year-old woman I particularly liked. When I opened the door, there was a young woman sitting on her sofa. She had dark hair and a pale face, but otherwise there was nothing unusual about her. When I walked in, she looked up, and we just stared at each other. I know I should say that the room turned cold, or fear struck my heart, or nope.jpg, but it wasn't like that. I said, "Oh, I'm sorry," and shut the door. I stood in the hall, wondering. I knew this woman's family, and didn't recognize the lady in the chair. Besides, why would anyone be here in the middle of the night? I opened the door again, and the woman was gone. My resident was sleeping peacefully in bed. I checked the bathroom, it was empty. The woman was gone. I very calmly shut the door, turned around, and went back to the nurse's station without finishing my rounds. As previously stated, I've often wanted to discuss these incidents, but don't want to sound crazy, superstitious, stupid. I didn't even tell my coworkers about the previous incident. My second story involves a resident whose name, for the sake of the story, shall be Frank. He was a very kind-natured older gentleman, a World War II vet with a streak of dementia but usually quite lucid, and always telling stories. He was popular with the staff, and other residents. We were all dismayed to watch him grow ill, and slowly become bedridden. One evening I arrived at work and was surprised to find Frank in the nursing office, in his wheelchair, wrapped in a blanket. Day shift pulled us aside and told a fairly remarkable story. A woman down the hall was dying. Hospice nurses had taken over, the family was there, everyone was just sort of waiting for the moment. She finally passed in the morning, and as the body was being cleaned and prepared for transport, there was a call from Frank. They entered the room and he was screaming, "They've coming for me, they've coming for me." Everybody said, "Who's coming for you?" And he said, "The man in the black suit." He came down the hall and stood at my door. Then he looked at a room down the hall. He was going to take some Italian guy. His name started with an O, but then he took a lady instead. And he's coming back for me. Frank was so distraught that he actually vaulted into his wheelchair and refused to go back to the room. He stayed in the nursing station all night, and was inconsolable. When he finally fell asleep, we put him to bed. There was an Italian resident whose name started with O, by the way. He lived next to the room where the woman died. This wasn't the first time Frank had said strange things about death. At one point he was very out of it, mumbling incoherently, sweating and hot. We thought he might pass at any moment. Until one day, when I came in to check on him, and found that he was sitting up in bed, completely healthy. I said, "Frank, how are you doing?" He said, "Oh, didn't you hear the good news? I was supposed to die last night, but then some other guy died instead. So now I feel better. I sure feel bad for that other guy." I often thought Frank had some sort of clairvoyance. The worst story, and perhaps the most alarming, has nothing to do with me. It's secondhand, but it's been retold several times over. I'll do my best, X. We have a parking garage attached to the building by elevator, and as Pittsburgh is brutally cold, it's a popular place to sneak out for smoke breaks, but only at night, when admin has already left. When I first started, one of the porters was a very large and intimidating, but actually rather polite, black gentleman whose name, for the sake of the story, shall be John. The facility is connected by locked hallway to a government-funded apartment complex called Lambeth, and occasionally creepy people would slip over into Canterbury. When that happened, John was usually the tough guy who threw them out. At the time, we had a 24-hour receptionist to work the phones. Our front door was locked. One night the receptionist was doing lazy receptionist things when she heard a pounding at the door. It was John, and he was screaming. She let him in, and he ran past her, slammed the door, and sat on a bench, panting heavily. He said that he was in the garage smoking, and saw something that scared him so terribly that he ran out of the parking garage, up the street, and to the front door. Eventually, after some time had passed, John told several coworkers that, while smoking in the garage, he noticed a figure in the distance, on the ramp. He took a few steps closer, thinking it was an escaped resident, but then froze in his tracks. It was a woman, wearing a very long formal gown, and facing away from him. She started to turn, very slowly, to face him, and as she was turning, he was struck with this deep and overwhelming sense of fear that literally sent him running off into the night. He never saw her face. I should have brought it up, but apparently, he didn't like to talk about it. Because people took an interest in Frank, I'd like to mention another incident involving a resident contacting, for lack of a non-stereotypical phrase, the other side. We had a very independent and lucid resident living on the 4th floor. She was very articulate, and did everything for herself. I was rather fond of her. One night during rounds, I entered her room to find that she was talking, presumably in her sleep. Anyone who does geriatric work knows that this isn't unusual. Though I found it odd for the woman in question, I decided to leave her alone and continue on my way. She didn't seem to be having a nightmare, or in any sort of distress. I stopped by her room during my final rounds. It was early morning, she was watching television and seemed rather cheerful. Out of curiosity, I asked her, "How did you sleep last night?" And she said, "Well, I didn't get much sleep, actually, because my sister came to visit." Don't you think it's unusual that your sister came to visit in the night? She smiled. Well, no, because she's dead. The resident claims that she woke during the night to find her deceased sister sitting in her easy chair. They talked about old times. The resident said that her sister looked cold, and she tried to offer her a blanket, but she declined. Frank was also a World War II vet, more specifically, a tank gunner. He had his ring finger shot off by a sniper, apparently, but kept shooting regardless. He didn't even realize his fingertip was gone until his friends pointed out that he was covered in blood. I suppose it was the rush of the moment. He would slip into these trances and start talking, in the moment. I remember him frequently saying, "PSSH, I ain't like Johnny. I ain't no goddamn coward."
Don't mean to hijack your thread op, but I also worked in a nursing home. It was during high school, and I was only a dietary aide, but my mother was the head nurse there, so I spent a lot of my free time volunteering there, talking to residents, and just getting to know them. I only have one particularly scary story to tell though. We had a resident, we'll call him Pete, who was very demented. He was a World War II vet who would occasionally flash back to the war, but in very calm ways. He'd sit there describing what he imagined was happening as if it were a book written in present tense. He wasn't lucid often, but when he was, he refused to talk about the war. Once, while telling one of his flashback-esque stories, another resident had a heart attack and died less than a foot away from Pete. We began to notice that, every time he told a story, about one every 2 weeks, a resident would die very quickly, always that same day. His final story was about him watching his higher-up, General? Lieutenant? IDK the military, die. The last line of his story was, he was born to die. Pete died in his sleep that night.
Your Pete reminds me of a very old Italian woman who was very Catholic and had OCD-like prayer routines that almost seemed occult. She also had a knack for predicting who would die next. She would shake her head and say, "Oh, that poor thing." This next series of incidents isn't paranormal, but it is rather creepy. After some time, I was trained to work the receptionist's job at the front desk. They needed nursing assistants to cover the lunches, and I also picked up shifts on occasion. One of my functions was switchboard operating. A resident called the front desk one evening sobbing hysterically, because a man had called her room and whispered that her house had burned to the ground. When she asked if her husband made it out, the voice said, "No, he's dead, and soon you'll be dead as well." I was very disturbed by this, and told the director. She said, "Oh, that's just the obscene caller. Apparently, this man has been calling Canterbury for years. He seems to know many details about the residents, so we suspect he's either a current, former employee, a Lambeth resident, or somebody with a shortwave radio who can overhear our walkie-talkies." He would often dial extensions straight to the residents' rooms, but occasionally he called the front desk. He has a very smooth, almost radio-quality voice, and he's surprisingly articulate. Every time I've answered his call, and it's happened maybe 5 or 6 times, he says, "Shish, don't hang up. I want you to hear something. Do you want to hear something? I want to come for you." I always hung up, except for one time, when I said, "Hey, just out of curiosity, why do you do this?" The time, he hung up on me. Apparently, he uses this strategy on old ladies, as well. As far as we know, he only calls the women. Sometimes he whispers horrible things, or threatens them. We had a resident, let's say, Carla, who was very young to be in an assisted living facility, 50 or so, but stayed with us because of disability. She was reasonably attractive for her age. The obscene caller began to ring her extension with some frequency, perhaps because of her noticeably younger voice. She started receiving letters in the mail. I only saw one of them. There were a total of 3, which she decided to keep, for evidence. It was an envelope with her full name, containing hair clippings and a wrinkled piece of paper saying, "Hi Carla." The paper had a visible stain that was probably ejaculate. The first letter apparently had a photo of her exiting our handicap van in our wheelchair, but she threw it away because she thought her teenage grandson was just pranking her.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.